Thank you very much for inviting me to talk here, and it's really charming of you to have on sale my book about the Chillingham Cattle, which I heartily recommend to you all, and to your friends and families as well. Okay, well, it's lovely to be asked to talk about the Chillingham cattle, but I thought I'd add a bit of other mammal ecology, and I'm very glad I did, because there are an amazing number of points actually of contact through to what Will's just been talking about as another aspect of our ecosystem. I'll say some words about the Chillingham herd and expand on those, and of course we can have questions afterwards. But the basis and essentials are what we have here. At least 1600s they've been in Chillingham Park, possibly much earlier. Long history of inbreeding with no known admixture from other breeds. Natural sex ratio and age distribution, breed all year round. Last time I spoke, the herd would have been 40 or 50. We've now got 140. And we also have 20 in the reserve herd, and we've got embryos, some embryos in store, and we're doing another storage project as soon as we can get the relevant permissions. Now, how did I get to Chillingham? Well, it was to do with my dad, and there he is in a state-of-the-art laboratory of the Scientific Civil Service in the 1960s, and he was always interested in cattle blood groups, and he got blood groups from the Chillingham cattle, of blood samples, and that led to him being on the council of the association, and that led to my own involvement in the herd. Okay, why was he interested in cattle blood groups? That's to do with parentage determination in pedigree livestock. And in those days, it was blood groups. It's now, obviously, in DNA at a finer and finer level. And I had great cooperation in doing the work from the relevant people at the herd and back at base with my wife, who has put up this activity for quite a long time. I've worked in quite a lot of other areas, what I'm going to talk about this evening is Chillingham cattle, but also something about some bankfoal work and some roe deer work and aurochs, extinct species. And in many ways they might not look particularly connected, but they are. And I was delighted to be able to point out some possible links to some of the topics that Will's just discussed. I also was involved in sheep welfare research, and there I am going to the south of France, and there's a boulangerie with the sheep looking out, carrying a heart rate recorder. And why was I in the back of the lorry? And it was because I was getting blood samples. And I'm glad to say that the drivers were very nice, and they let me ride in the cab on the way home again. But this was all to do with the science of animal welfare. And that was a good self-contained thing to be involved with. But my own interests have gone more towards the ecological area since then. I've worked on traditional livestock systems in Africa and on livestock biodiversity generally. Right, well, here we have some bankfoals in our garden in Lincoln, and that's with the trail camera. You can see there they are busily behaving. That's the birds speaking, not us, but there's the first piece of ecoacoustics. And I got involved with bankfoals. Yes, there we are. I got involved in them partly because I was interested in the genetics, and I was particularly concerned with the hemoglobin variation. In humans, there's hemoglobin polymorphisms. You'll have heard of sickle cell hemoglobin. But I discovered there was geographic variation in the hemoglobins in bankfoals. There was HBS, as I call it, and you'll see why it's HBS, in the north of Britain, and HBF in the south. And why should there be two sorts? There had been some work on hemoglobin in bankfoals, but this variation had not been reported elsewhere. And pretty much at the same time, a group in York got involved with chromosomal variation in British small mammals, and they found patterns of variation that could be explained by looking at what happened after the ice ages receded. Well, the current most active group in this is now in the Czech Republic. And the work which I did, which looks unbelievably naive all those years ago, those are my trapping sites for bank voles in the summer of 1975. Those ones in the northeast, those blue ones, that is in fact Chillingham Park, but also Castle Eden Dean. And down in the south I got quite a few more areas, but I was finding that in the north you had the HBS, which migrated more slowly in an electric field. And you could get clearer things if you treated the starch gel. I mean, this is so primitive when you look back on how things are done now. But I was putting in mercaptoethanol, which is an incredibly smelly substance, but it helped you to get lovely, clear, crisp electrophoresis. And I mated some of my HBS and HBF voles, and that gave me HBFS, fast and slow, and that helped to show it was genetic, which is an important part of showing the thing. Well, why should there be different sorts of hemoglobin in British bank voles? Well, 45 years later, this is how bank voles are seen across Europe. There's a great stack of different mitochondrial DNA clades, and this is all to do with colonisation after the last glaciations. And the present day distribution of genotypes of hemoglobin in Britain, it does in fact imply a two-stage colonisation. Now you can see Britain there, because the Ireland one, that's a distraction because bank voles in Ireland are not native, they were introduced by accident. Probably came from Germany, but you can see that it's more the western and northern fringes of Britain that have got one particular, the Carpathian clade, and the western clade, as we now see it in mitochondrial DNA, is over the rest of Britain, and that roughly corresponds to my HBF and HBS thing. Now, it would appear that this is to do with what happened around what's called the Younger Dryas period, which was about 10,500 BC, and never mind the details of the Dogger Bank map, but the point is that at the last ice age, when the glaciers receded, you could get flora and fauna recolonising in Doggerland, and that would include the soil fauna and flora, and the colonising flora, as we know, included people, but there was an interruption in this period, and that was called the Younger Dryas, where you sort of temporary growth of glaciers in northwest Scotland, and that was a kind of glitch in the whole system. Not long after that, the Doggerland was swept away by a combination of water released from a North American lake collapsing and an underground landslide, an underwater landslide off Norway, and that swept Doggerland away. But there was a kind of inhabitable area where there is now the North Sea. So there's no problem with the notion of bank voles colonising across the North Sea. So the current hypothesis is that these animals colonised twice, once before the Younger Dryas, and those had HBS in my view. The second colonisation was a more adapted, form adapted to warmer conditions, and that's the HBF. And that appears to have pushed the former ones, the Celtic ones if you like, into the west and north. And you can see, arguably, there could be a parallel here with the way Neolithic people coming into Britain pushed the Mesolithic people into the west and north. Obviously there are more genes involved than the hemoglobin alone, but I'd love to see the physiology of hemoglobins and whether it differs between these two types. And my excuse for including this here is because it might link with aurochs prehistory, the aurochs being the extinct ancestor of the aurochs. And it's at least possible the aurochs colonised Britain twice. And the Chillingham behaviour studies I've done, I think, can hint as to how the colonisation might have taken place in terms of behavioural mechanisms. Right, now, say a bit about Chillingham before actually coming back to the aurochs in due course. And there's really, we do need a description. I need to tell you what these things look like. The mature bull, in the 1980s, they're pretty small. They can be up to 400 kilos now. There's been a major change in the whole ecosystem with, in 2005, when the flock of sheep that had been in Chillingham Park were removed, and that really has, I've got a graph to show you what happened with the numbers in the herd. The conformation, they've got an old-fashioned conformation, they're like medieval cattle basically. Long legs and a short body. That's not what you want with beef animals. You want lots of meat on the expensive parts, and you want a long body and short legs, and that's what modern cattle are like. They all have horns, all are white with red ears, and there's some spotting on the face, neck and shoulders. Right, now, heavy text, but it's a relatively simple message. Up until the 1970s, it was felt that animal welfare studies benefited from looking at wild relatives, and there's some great work done, say on wild boar, and that has actually helped to understand how to maximise the welfare of husbanded pigs. There was work on jungle fowl, which has told us something about how chickens behave, but these natural behaviours are still an important interest of animal welfare science, but things have moved on so much since then. But unfortunately, among a lot of influential constituencies, natural behaviour is where it begins and ends. Once you know how to apply psychological techniques to animal behaviour, you can actually ask the animals what's important to them. You can, say, make the hen work to have access to a dust bathing or to a bigger cage. You know, you can actually quantify all this. Now, but on the other hand, the natural behaviour concept surfaces again in the form of respect for the sentience and sensitivity of animals. So there is a place for studying the unconstrained behaviour of cattle in this way. Right, now the Chillingham cattle, one of the things I really noticed about the behaviour was how very active they are socially, and it's what bulls and cows tell me every 10 minutes or every 27 minutes at night there's some form of social interaction. During grazing, bulls will displace each other. Not that often, cows say once every 91 minutes, but the recordable displacements, when you see what's clearly a displacement, in bulls 58% is preceded by an obvious social behaviour, in cows not, much less. And I think what's going on here is that the cows show less displacing behaviour, because if a cow is very expressive about her displacing behaviour, a bull's going to come along and tell her, who do you think you are? And the behaviour of the bulls is more demonstrative, and that of the cows is less overt. The bulls interact, and here we have the top 3 pictures and the bottom left one are of different forms of behaviour in the bulls. The other 2 pictures are of the banteng and the gaur, which are relatively close relatives of the of cattle. A very important part of the behaviour is not waving horns at each other, it's leaning towards and showing how big your shoulders are. And you can see in the gaur these morphological adaptations that really emphasise the size of the shoulders. You know, they've got a dewlap and things. Incidentally, North American bison, at the rutting season, the bull grows a beard, and that increases the size of his lateral profile. Anyway, you can see all this happening in the Chillingham herd and work out probabilities of escalation from one form of social interaction to another. Right. Let's see, get the That's a calf calling, and there's the voice print. There's a bull calling. Right, with the bulls, vocalizations going on here, and the cow calling and the bull's lowing, that first one that the bull showed, they're amplified versions of the calf call. Whereas the bull's call is something completely new, and this has not been reported in any other cattle. What we have here, and it's quite unusual for a mammal, most mammals, the adult call is simply a very loud juvenile call. Whereas here, there's a completely different call in the adult. And that is a matter of speculation. I think it might be something to do with the structure of the larynx, the musculature. They're not so heavily built around the neck, makes it possible to get these harmonics and that clarity of the call, or bugle as some people call it. And this is one point in which the behaviour of the cattle is very different from that of other ones. As it happens, the herd is now roughly equal male and female. And you've got competition for mating. Here we have a heifer in heat, so you can see her tail swishing around, and that helps to show her as being possibly conceptive. And there's one bull accompanying her, another three looking on, not quite sure what they can do about this. The bulls cows won't usually conceive until they're 3 or 4 years old, but they can conceive much younger than that. In maternal behaviour, the cow leaves the herd to calf, and she leaves the calf after the first feed and returns to the herd. And it's very clear, and I actually include sort of diary accounts in the book of successful calvings. That's to say, where the cow actually comes back and feeds the calf, looks after it. There's some occasions when the draw of the herd is just too strong, and especially with a new calving cow, and she might just abandon the calf at that point. So far as I can see, the affinity between the cow and the calf does not persist into adulthood. The bulls sometimes fight, and they sometimes get killed, and many show signs of old wounds. The bulls spend a high proportion of their time in social behaviour, and that cuts down the grazing time, and that compensates to some extent by grazing at night. We don't need to go into this in massive detail. The bottom line is, in daytime, the bulls have shorter bouts. That's to say, periods during which the nose is down in the ground, which are about 5 minutes on average. Whereas at night, it's the bulls that have the longer bouts. And that means that the bulls, to some extent, make up at night for what they fail to get during the day. This is how herd numbers have gone in the herd. I said that in 2005 the sheep were removed from the park and the numbers have gone up like anything. Now, there is we don't know, there isn't an obvious mechanism to stop them breeding. I mean, after all, they are descended from domesticated animals, and any gene that would stop animals breeding when they get a lot of them, that's not going to be selected in domestication, rather the reverse. So I suspect that the pattern is going to be this seesaw arrangement around the current level. And we could easily lose 10 calves in a bad storm. Like in Storm Arwen, we lost a lot of calves. And this seems to be the way the numbers are actually going. I should say they'd get hay in winter, but it's really, spring is a difficult time. Now, Will mentioned the long-term experiment with grass. Well, we've got data like that as well. We've got 1862 calving rates, calves per cow per year, 0.31. Most recent data I've been able to calculate is higher. We've got more calves per cow per year now than we did 160 years ago. So, in spite of their being inbred, they still retain their female fertility. Very rarely or never seen at Chillingham. There's some behaviours, licking other animals. That is seen as a sign of good welfare in some welfare codes, but arguably it could actually be a stress relief behaviour. This was in the paper recently about Veronica, the cow scratching herself with a stick, and I've not seen that at Chillingham. The wardens may have. but we'll have to leave them to it. There have been changes in behaviour in the herd. There used to be only 40 or 50 animals in the herd, and at that time the bulls had a sort of shared own rangery system, but now there's a much larger herd, and it seems that there are maybe two clearly distinct sub-herds. Now, Will mentioned fertility, well, in question mentioned fertility of the soil, and it's quite interesting to see that at the mammalian level there's a set of behavioural responses, because how long the animal actually has his or her nose down in the grass is partly predicted by the botanical composition. It's not entirely the amount of grass growing there, it's the actual composition of the species in the grass seems to have a possible effect. And when it's a poor sward quality, the bulls tend to have shorter grazing bouts, but it's the other way around with the cows. They have longer grazing bouts, and that's part of bulls being distracted, cows less so. And there is an ecological approach to comparative mammalian ecology to talk about whether animals are time minimizers. Do they feed as quickly as possible to have time for something else, or are they energy maximizers? And it looks as though these bulls are time minimizers, while cows are energy maximizers. They keep at it to try and keep their rate of consumption up. We've got data back to 1978 for plant species. We had to fertilise with lime, and that had substantial changes in the veg, and so we had quite a high species diversity, which had declined in 06 to 08. It's started going up again, so far as we can tell, and we're having a survey done this summer using precisely the same methodology, the same study areas, to see how things are going now. And this is the concept that if you've got greater fertility, you'll get lower plant diversity. And these little drawings are beautiful illustrations of that. Well, we lined the park because in 1980, because we were losing cows through magnesium deficiency. And effectively, it was because the herd and the sheep together, there was too much for the park. And so the place was limed, and that is what caused our plant diversity to go down. It was more fertile, but we've had no subsequent deaths of cows from magnesium deficiency. So this is an illustration of prioritisation. We had to accept a loss of diversity in order to sustain the herd. Okay, now I'm going to say a few words about roe deer, which I've also worked on, and you'll see how this does link through to the Chillingham work, but it was partly because I was looking at the behaviour of the cattle, the grazing behaviour of the cattle in relation to the veg, and I was interested in bout lengths, because if you watch cows, you end up saying they spend 30% of that time grazing. You've put in an awful lot of hours and got one figure out at the end of it. But if you look at the bout lengths, you can get so much more and so much more information. And that led to some work I did on roe deer, because I was in France, at a postdoc at this amazing place called Chizé, it's still going well down in Poitou-Charentes. And the aim was to go out to the South Atlantic, the South Indian Ocean, to look at feral cattle on Amsterdam Island, which is halfway between South Africa and Australia. Well, that expedition didn't happen, but I was free to do research in this amazing 2,600 hectare woodland. And they had roe deer there on a grassy paddock. Now, having worked at Chillingham, I was interested in how grazing and interval behaviour come together, and that actually is quite topical at the moment in relation to rewilding as well, because looking at grazing behaviour of deer, it's very often explicable what you see in terms of a concept of a landscape of fear, is that their structure of their behaviour is partly modulated by the fear anticipation of predation. So we don't need to go into this massive detail, because here we have observations of a wild roe deer. Now each of these points is the sum total of grazing and interval behaviour, which means walking generally. You can see, so by that point, the deer has grazed for 200 seconds and has been moving, its interval behaviour, mainly walking, for 400. Now, I could have just done an average amount of proportion of time spent grazing or interval there, but when you get the thing drawn out as trajectories, then you could, when I was watching that wild roe deer, it was quite clear that it went out of sight at that point, and then it found a rather more favourable place to graze, because now it's stacking up grazing time more quickly than it's stacking up intervaling time. And that's in the forest, and if it was exactly the same progression of grazing and interval, you'd be on the 45-degree line. Well, on the grassland, this particular deer was doing this. She was doing a lot of grazing, then an intervaling period, which was obviously moving to another slightly different area, then piling up the grazing behaviour, then another interval period, another. So the roe deer has got two possible strategies here. It can either have a steady incremental approach to grazing, and browsing I should say, that would be appropriate in walking and picking a bramble leaf here and an acorn there and a blade of grass here. Whereas if they're on grass or a crop, they have a bout length type behaviour that stacks up like that. So the reason for doing this was that you can then apply this in species-rich grassland with sheep grazing, and we've just done that in Estonia. You pick up you fit a GoPro camera onto the sheep, and that, because you've got recording for sound, you're getting bites as well as steps. You can also identify what vegetable community they're on, and this all relates to working out how grazing animals and different vegetation types interact. And I think this is something that's going to be very useful if we're rewilding with a view to increasing plant diversity. Right, let's zoom back to Chillingham. As I said, the cattle have been there for a long time. The castle's been there for umpteen years, back to the 1300s. The family have been associated with Chillingham Castle. What it is, it's a landscape that's actually a designed landscape dating from about 1799, and it's superimposed on a medieval deer park, and the designer was the estate steward, and up to 1980 it was owned by the Earls of Tankerville, then by College Valley Estates, and then Chillingham Wild Cattle Association bought it, reuniting the herd and the woodlands under the same ownership. So we've got old trees and we've got semi-natural grassland. There's a classic ancient oak. There are several reasons, documentary reasons, for confirming that planting date of about 1600. But there it is, and it's stuffed with biodiversity, epiphytes, deadwood, you name it, it's there. These are maps. You can actually see this at Woodhorn at the County Archives. I've reproduced these in the book. But that's the design that was operating in 1711. That was the first iteration of redesign. And I'll mention these maps again, but only in outline. The design that you can deduce from the Ordnance Survey map of 1860 is basically we've got a quadrant system. We've got the eastern quadrant, which is where the cattle were. We've got the northern, the southern and the western, and these would be areas for hay and possibly winter, autumn extra feed. That's the bit that we actually own, the Chillingham Wild Cattle Association. We don't have rare plants in Chillingham, particularly, but it's an unusually species-rich, infertile grassland. It's very unusual that we've got the trees and the pasture, and we get support for the conservation of these things. Okay, so the landscape, if you like, is a theatre for the genes to zoom about in having fun. And one of the first questions that's asked about Chillingham and its genetics are, what does it relate to anything else? Is a Chillingham herd a direct descendant of wild cattle without a domesticated stage? Well, that's very difficult to justify. Something to do with the Romans or a relic of late medieval farming, all these possibilities. This is the standard way, or it was when this paper was published, of showing how different breeds relate to each other. And the Chillingham cattle here is not terribly close to anything, really. And there the Romagnola and Chianina as Italian cattle. So it has no clear affinity to the Italian breeds. And there's an aurochs somewhere in the middle here. Where is the aurochs? Isn't on this graph. But the point is, there's no support for the notion of a direct descent from the aurochs without intervening domestication. In breeding, now what we have here are four look like really badly broken cones, but these indicate areas in the chromosome where there is heterozygosity or homozygosity. Now, if you look at the Chianina, the Romagnola, and the Holstein, the three bottom ones, you see throughout that region of the genome, almost all the loci are heterozygous. You've got both forms of the DNA there. Chillingham, we've got what are called regions of homozygosity, and they're massive. Vast areas of the Chillingham genome are homozygous, and that supports elegantly the historical notion of them being totally inbred. So, purging, what's happened, and I do go into this in the book with and to explain it. Basically, there's no end of experience, whether experiments or theory, to say that out of 20 cases of intense inbreeding, 19 will die out. 1 out of 20 cases is a statistical thing, really. By sheer chance, any really, really harmful genes die out without wiping out the whole population. You end up with genes which are not harmful. They won't be very good, but they're not lethal. And that doesn't matter if you're not competing with anything else, which the Chillingham cattle aren't. And this is, I think, this fits in beautifully with the breeding success being no different, or if anything slightly higher, now than it was back in 1860 for the females. So it looks like the Chillingham is the 1 in 20. And in fact, they're more inbred than any other non-lab population. They have a gene which is worth special attention, and that is the gene that causes the colour side, the coat colour. And it's actually what the base colour of the Chillingham cattle is red-brown. It's just they've got this massive white patch over the entire animal, apart from the ears and a few spots here and there. And that's a gene called the colour-sided pattern, and it's also found in some other breeds, especially Scandi breeds, but also some of the ones around the Irish Sea into Solway Firth, like the white variety of the Galloway, the Irish Moiled, and it's at least possible that Vikings introduced cattle to the Solway Firth or Irish Sea area, and before these breeds all split apart, and the Chillingham cattle, I would suggest the hypothesis, they were put together in medieval or late medieval times from attracted animals in the vicinity. Now, genetics and fertility, this is an interesting one because, and I said about genes not being lethal but not being great, there's testicular hyperplasia, this reduction in testis size, and similar thing happens with the ovaries. You've got this in Chillingham bulls, and you've also got it in Swedish mountain cattle, where it's very clear that it's the colour-sided gene that's causing this. So the Chillingham, the bulls, that explains the bull's subfertility, and almost certainly the fact that there are any calves there is due to multiple insemination. So you see, I'm really going against some of the wonderful old stories about Chillingham, that it's something to do with the Roman wall, one thing, and another thing about there's something to do with the king bull being the only one who sires calves. These things, they may be true in some shape or form that's not quite linked to that language, and I'll say a little bit about that. But we've got other explanations for these things, which are based on actual genetic results. I'll say a very few words about another herd of cattle that lives on the bone, because this actually links through, along with Chillingham, to the aurochs concept that I want to talk about. That's the island of Swona. So it's, there it is, receding into the distance, and there it is off South Run, let's say. And on it, there's a herd of Aberdeen Angus cross shorthorn cattle, and they've been there since 1974, abandoned since 1978. There are currently about 20 of them. In winter, they don't get any supplementation because the people don't go to the island, certainly not to feed them. They seem to depend on cast-up seaweed, and there they are, eating the seaweed. And I went there when there was nothing for them to eat. I wanted to see what they did with the seaweed. And I was very interested to see that when the grass is all gone, they don't disperse, they forage as a group. And also, they're exceedingly wary of people. And that was two behavioural observations which kind of linked through to Chillingham. Incidentally, they're conventional, traditional beef cattle, but they're clearly pretty hardy creatures. Now, how does this tie through to the aurochs? Aurochs was domesticated 10,000 years ago. As our farming spread, the wild aurochs was displaced. Neolithic cattle were tiny. They were a lot smaller than Chillingham cattle. Well, they could be as big as Chillingham cattle, but not much. Not really quite as big. There's no evidence the aurochs was ever domesticated in Britain, but it's possible that wild aurochs might have mated with domesticated cattle. Cave paintings date from well before farming, 40,000 BC, and that's where the aurochs was. Hugely successful species, but many different races of aurochs across that area. Now, these are sites, British archaeological sites with aurochs. Most sites haven't been dated, and those are the ones with the tiny little blobs there. The other periods don't really matter too much. That's where the only really good piece of ancient aurochs DNA has been typed for mitochondrial DNA. But the fact that there are aurochs of undoubted Pleistocene and late glacial dates implies that they did colonise Britain in the very cold conditions when the Younger Dryas was still in operation. But the other finds, the Mesolithic and Neolithic finds, imply a recolonisation after the rapid climate warming that happened at the end of the Younger Dryas. And that would have been impossible after Doggerland was destroyed. So in a way, it's as though the cattle are doing the same as the bankfoals. But the aurochs are doing a two-phase colonisation. So amazing, it's one of those things where you've got advances in understanding the bankfoals have actually all come from the DNA of present-day animals. This concept for the aurochs at the moment has come from ancient DNA, but who knows, if we can get more aurochs ancient DNA, we might be able to test that one out further. Now, the aurochs, it had a behavioural ecology, it's an extinct species, but was it a woodland animal? Now that's really important for rewilding. People think of, very often the aurochs is put across as being a woodland animal. There's nothing of the sort. But what did it live in? And so far as how it behaved, can the Chillingham cattle, and I might add the Swona cattle, give us some hints as to how it behaved? And I had a nice time looking at map references for places where those archaeological finds have been. And you've seen that map of the aurochs archaeological finds. And if you look at the Ordnance Survey map today, you can see what the baseline ecology was. How low is it above sea level? What is the distance between the highest and lowest contour? Is there a watercourse? Is there a pond? So to what extent does the present-day ecology fit with the physical geography for these different species? If we find that the present-day map square characteristics look right for the ecology of these species whose ecology we know, we might infer from that that it should indicate the ecology of the extinct aurochs. And these were some of the features. Oh yes, and including presence, absence of cliff, lake and woodland. Well, obviously a woodland today is no sort of guide to what the woodland was all those years ago when the aurochs was around, but it is indicative of the general productivity, if you like, of the soil. So the whole thing I had was a controlled study. But in this, so for example, here we have one of the aurochs finds. You've got 188 finds that Derek Yalden put in his book, and Swaffham Prior Fen. The aurochs was somewhere in here. Well, that square, there's one contour line through it. We can measure that distance. There's probably about 2 kilometres of watercourse there, which we can weather. There's no woodland. We can look at another one, another species. Well, here we have a fine square near Bridlington where there was beaver and wolf, and that area's got quite a few contour lines, and we can work out the distance between the highest and lowest contour line. It's got a certain amount of watercourse. It's got ponds. No, again, no woodland. Well, if you bung all this together, then there's some things that map squares that have an ancient beaver find have today, they're relatively likely to have a lake. And similar for bear and wolf, map squares for bear and wolf are relatively likely to have a cliff. And that's what you predict. And aurochs tend to be found in areas which lack woodland today, and that suggests to me that aurochs was a creature of the more fertile areas, in that they are found in areas which today are not considered that fertile and only worth growing woodland on. You see, the argument is by analogy, it's not direct, but say we take the find squares. This is the distance between the contours, highest and lowest contours. A beaver is obviously very flat, aurochs very flat, elk, roe, red, wolf, bear, brown bear, they're all going for areas that are a bit more up and downy. And that suggests the aurochs was a creature of flat areas. So it looks as though the aurochs was associated with flat, low-lying, highly fertile areas like floodplains. It was not so strongly associated with uplands and woodlands. The main herbivores of the more upland woodlands were probably red deer. Well, we can speculate. Well, it's great to speculate, done not too assertively. I think that with the aurochs, looking at what happens with the Chillingham cattle, that the stimulus for weaning of a calf might be the birth of the next calf, and if that happens, then they have to have a behavioural mechanism for the cow who's been looking after what is now a yearling, she might well still be suckling it, suddenly has to identify with this blob that suddenly appeared, the new neonate. Now that suggests that for cattle, there must have been heavy selection in nature for a strong imprinting tendency. And supporting that, at Chillingham, the cattle are relatively approachable, and that's because they see the warden pretty much every day. On Swona, they run to the other end of the island. You see, they are not imprinted in any way on humans. And again, with that strong imprinting tendency, if I were going to try and domesticate the aurochs, I'd go and wait till I saw an aurochs cow giving birth, then I'd kill it, if possible, and nick the calf and imprint it on me, you see. And over a period of time, then the genetic background of that is going to be selected, and you've got domestication. At the other end of the age distribution, I found that Swona, the fact that they would assemble for seaweed when there was no grass, suggested that when herd conditions are bad, the biology of cattle is to aggregate rather than disperse. And again, if that has a genetic basis, that would favour domestication. Almost certainly peer group relationships are more important than cow-offspring relationships. And now numbers are high at the herd. It looks as though the Chillingham herd is showing fission, and there are plenty of studies in domesticated cattle and husbanded cattle that a herd size 40 or 50 is quite a stable one. There may be a threshold around 40 or 50 animals at which they'll aggregate in response to that lack of food and move as a group and colonise a new area. And I would suggest that colonisation by the aurochs post-glaciation may have involved dispersal by peer groups of young cattle. And all sorts of this. This probably went on like anything in Doggerland. And now we get occasional notice of that when a trawler turns up an auroch skull, which less of that happening now because Dogger Bank has been so very heavily trawled. The cattle, yes, and I think that all those processes would be facilitated by year-round breeding, which in my opinion is the actual native, naturally selected practice of cattle. Some people say the aurochs had a rut, not a scrap of evidence for this. And anyway, if you look at the breeding season of cattle, they're all capable of cattle and bison and the other relatives. These animals can all breed all year round. Right, there's some implications for Chillingham management and such. So there's a question, to what extent are they wild? And some of you might maybe all going to spring this on me as a question. So, but they are descended from wild domesticated stock, so strictly speaking they are feral. And worldwide feral cattle are very, very few, even fewer that lack human interference. The Aleutian Islands, there's some in Australia, the Falkland Islands have probably lost theirs. Swona herd. There's a so-called feral herd in Hong Kong, but they are managed. They have a certain amount of freedom, but they're nowhere near in the fully wild state. I would say the Chillingham herd is the only long-established free-ranging herd with a natural sex ratio and age distribution and no castration. And I see them as wild in the sense of free-willed. In many ways, given our attitudes towards things like grey squirrels and complicated and conflicted notions with urban foxes and all the rest of it, the word wild is quite a crude one. And I think I'm very contented to see the cattle as being wild in the sense of being free-willed. They are of domesticated lineage, but they're not tamed. They have a special status, and we can go into that in detail if you've got specific questions on that one. To conserve them, we've got to be, with that homozygosity, we have to accept these are incredibly vulnerable to disease. As if there's so many emerging diseases coming along. Biosecurity is crucially important, and the backup reserve and embryo herds are really, really vital. Well, I hope they're not vital, but they're a vital ultimate backstop to have. Chillingham as a park, it used to be basically seen as just where the cattle live. It is a set of habitats and landscapes and a conservation portfolio in its own right. Into the future, looks like a big herd, 140, but as I say, well, without that number, half male, half female, we're only getting 15 or so calves a year. And we mustn't think we've got a vast number of surplus bulls, because almost certainly the calves depend on multiple insemination. So we've got to be careful about not assuming too much about their actual reproductive potential. Right, so thank you for your attention. We've gone over quite a lot of different areas, but I think they kind of gel together. But I'd be delighted if there's time for any questions.